This the program will soon start. Sasakawa Peace Foundation China Observer will start soon. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us at the SPF China Observer Forum. We appreciate your taking part in the Sasakawa Peace Foundation Open Forum, SPF China Observer. The title is The World View of China in Competition with the New U.S. Administration. With us Professor Akio Takahara, University of Tokyo, and Professor Ichiro Inoue of Kwansei Gakuin University as panelists. I'll be serving as the moderator. My name is Bonji Ohara, the Sasakawa Peace Foundation Senior Fellow. First, we'll be inviting Professor Inoue to explain the title entitled The China World View in Competition with the New U.S. Administration. Professor Inoue feels that China is not following international order that is prevailing today. China is insisting on a different international order. In words, they say that it is UN-centric international order. That is what is being advocated by China. But what is in the backdrop? What is the China's view? What is the world view of China in the backdrop of their argument? That is going to be the major topic of discussion today. Also, Professor Inoue has provided his author paper, and subsequently, in the study group with the Central Politburo of the Communist Party, Xi Jinping has also provided new instruction. This was widely reported in the media. And he has argued that efforts will be made to create an image of China that is loved and respected. And in this argument, they include sense of values as well. So in the context of the foreign public, CCP needs to be understood that it is making effort for the public in China. And also, why is it that Communist Party is so capable? Why is it Marxism is excellent? What are some of the unique features of the Chinese democracy? All of these need to be understood by the foreign public. And also, efforts, they need to create a system to create communication that argue and that point to the advantages of the Chinese democracy. So such instructions and comments made by Xi Jinping, and taking a look at such press coverage, we would like to deepen our discussion today. First, I will be inviting Professor Inoue to talk about his views of the worldview of China. What does worldview of China entail? He will speak for the next 15 to 20 minutes. Professor Inoue, the floor is yours.
The kind introduction. I am Inoue, the professor at the Kwansei Gakuin University. I am studying the foreign policy of China as China has become a great power. What kind of relationship is she trying to build with the other countries? And I have actually put my paper on SPF China Observer entitled The Worldview of China in Competition with the New U.S. Administration. So let me very briefly introduce my paper. As you may know, in the United States, the new Biden administration has been born, and the new administration has made clear that it will actually be continuing the very harsh the stance of the U.S. government vis-à-vis China. And China is also trying to actively strengthen its relationship with friends and neighbors in trying to counter the United States. And more conspicuously, in the field of ideology, China is clearly stating its legitimacy of its own political regime squarely, and very clearly objecting to the international order based upon the Western-based values. So the confrontation with the United States seems to be getting more difficult, and we would like to look at what kind of worldview does China has, and what kind of international order is she trying to build. At the NPC, every year, the foreign minister that gives the press conference and give a comprehensive explanation on the foreign policy of China. And I have taken this as material for my research, the statement made by Wan Yi, the state councillor. And towards the end of the March, the Yang Jiechi, the member of Politburo, and also Minister Wan Yi that was there as well. They met in Anchorage with the top leaders of the foreign policy of the United States. And there was indeed the very harsh words that have been exchanged. And I have also focused on Yang Jiechi's rhetoric, the rhetoric of the foreign policy the makers and leaders and their actual actions. There seems to be nuanced differences. We should also pay attention to that. But looking at the statements made by the Chinese, the foreign policy the leaders, that China will not support the Western-based, the so-called rule-based international order, but it will support the United Nations-centric international order. There seems to be some harsh confrontation going on between China and the United States, not only countering the United States, but under President Xi Jinping, the so-called strong power and great power relations. China is becoming increasingly confident of itself, and the new concept of the Belt the Road Initiative, and also the concept of the community of shared future as put forward. And that seems to be reflected on the new worldview of the China. So as Wan Yi has said, that China will be guarding unwavering the international system which is centric upon United Nations and will defend the international law or the based the international order. And the United Nations is not a club of the big powers or the rich countries, but the sovereignty of each country is the equal. And no country will be able to assume upon itself all the international challenges. And at the Anchorage between the U.S. and China with the foreign policy leaders, at the meeting, Yang Jiechi has said very clearly that China and the international community is following and supporting the United Nations-centric international system and international order as based upon the international law and not the so-called rule-based international order as asserted by some of the countries. The U.S. or the Western countries cannot represent the international opinion. And the overwhelming majority of the world, the countries, would not believe that rule-based international order would form the foundation because it has been formulated just by the minority, the group of people. And Wan Yi has been answering to the question raised by Egyptian reporter that the model is not just the one. It is a systemic hegemony, if you are to assert on that you are the only one who is the right, and try to slander the other systems and apply pressure. And as Wan Yi has said, China has a democracy which is based upon its own Chinese circumstances, which has always been asserted, and that the labeling of China as being authoritarian or dictatorship will not be a democratic the attitude. And to force on the China a regime or system that would be interfering into domestic affairs. So China has always been defensive in trying to argue about the political regime. But more recently, on the concept per se of a democracy, the so-called Chinese style of democracy is also a democracy in trying to legitimize its own regime squarely. In the background of this is that in the Chinese foreign policy, there seems to be trying to raise the influence of the Chinese discourse within the forum where international debate goes on, try to strengthen the voice of China. As Mr. Ohara has been saying, in May, Xi Jinping has said that it should strengthen its communication ability and power. And I'm sure there will be debate to be seen later on this question.
Policy of opening and reform, China has actually utilized the prevailing international order that was created by US and Europe, such as free trade system, for their own benefit. So therefore, it could be said that China is one of the major beneficiaries of the prevailing international order. In the recent years, many researchers and international political scientists in China, they are researchers, so therefore they have taken various attitudes and positions, but majority of them have never envisioned that China would in near future would confront the international order head-on, and that they would try to take place of the United States. Very few people accepted that, but now Xi Jinping era is now emphasizing new international order and also community with a shared future for mankind, and also Belt and Road Initiative. Behind these concepts, there is the intent or glimpse of intent for China to form its own international order. For example, the former Chinese ambassador to the United Kingdom, Ambassador Fu Yang, she's a female ambassador, Fu Yang, already as early as 2016, in Chatham House in the UK Think House, made the following statement. She stated that there are three pillars of international order: sense of values formed by U.S. and Europe, U.S. military network, and multilateral institutions based on the United Nations. And China only feels a sense of belonging to the UN-centric international order. That's what she said. As was mentioned by Yang Jiechi and Wang Ying, in the form of United Nations, developed economies such as U.S. and Europe are actually in the minority. Majority are developing economies in developing countries. Many of these countries have experienced colonialism, and they're not going to uncritically accept sense of values that were historically formed by U.S. and European countries. They're not going to accept such values easily. On the other hand, the idealism and the philosophy of the United Nations can be glimpsed from the Atlantic Charter, which was actually formed by the meeting between Roosevelt and Churchill back in 1941. This being the basis for the new UN. And the underlying norm and thinking is actually liberalism of UK and the United Kingdom. This is the underlying fundamental ideals behind the United Nations. So Yang Jiechi says that China only supports the UN system, not international order that is based on rules advocated by a few countries. But originally, the UN system itself is based on is actually rule-based international order. Also, the intentions of the objective of the United Nations is to safeguard world peace and safety. Also, to respect human rights and basic freedom. So, therefore, if China were to exert and strengthen its influence in the United Nations, actually, there's a concern that they could actually serve to undermine and encroach upon the basic philosophy which has been existent in the United Nations. Because China may actually try to use the majority of the United Nations to their advantage. So therefore, when China says that they support UN-centric international order, and as a result of their enhancing their influence, it's not so much that they understand, and it's not that they identify and understand the philosophy of the United Nations. There are concerns that actually Chinese influence expanded in the United Nations serve to encroach upon the UN philosophy. Of course, the Chinese model is one which enjoys short-term development without painful political reform, and that may seem very attractive for authoritarian-minded developing countries. But then the Chinese model cannot be readily emulated by other developing countries. So, community with a shared future for mankind and international order, these are concepts being advocated by China are very ambiguous, and they have not yet come to gain widespread support from other developing countries. Actually, because of their massive economic power, they're gaining this has become the source of their support among the developing countries. So I mentioned that Chinese are trying to enhance the Chinese discourse in the international discussion. But again, this is not yet at a stage where they're able to gain where they're actually resonating among the foreign public, which is aspiration of the original public diplomacy. Yeah, my idea is this. There are competition and confrontation with the United States. This has now been elevated to the ideological competition. And also, Chinese perception in the US and UK, in the European countries has become very harsh. But the China is trying to face such competition head-on. But does this represent a very realistic and logical strategy for China? Does China believe that they can actually compete and win in this competition? Of course, the views of the Chinese political policy setters are very difficult to gauge. But the Chinese probably perceive that the U.S. power is beginning to go on a long-term downward trend. And also, under Trump, the confusion in the democracy also became to light. So as a result, the Chinese are gaining confidence about their own system against this backdrop. On the other hand, the Biden administration's Chinese policy remained to be very harsh, succeeding the very harsh policies from the previous government. And also, Biden is moving to great comprehensive collaboration with other allied nations and friendly nations. And maybe the Chinese are anxious about the very quick action taken part of the U.S. government. So when the international environment changed, especially when the change was to the negative trend, or when they were facing difficulties in terms of diplomacy, the Chinese maintain very aggressive stance on the surface. But in reality, in their action, they very quietly and craftily changed course in the past. That has been the case in the past. So therefore, they had a face of realists which pursued their national interests in a very realistic manner. However, what about China now? They are now bound by domestic elements, and it's very difficult for China to carry out flexible diplomacy at this moment. That can be easily imagined. For example, as we have seen, in terms of the argument related to Hong Kong and Uyghur Xinjiang, Xi Jinping remained very aggressive in his position. He did not waver from that. And on top of that, when you take a look at the domestic political calendar for China going forward, in July they will have the 100 years anniversary for the Communist Party, and next fall they will have the 20th National Congress of the Communist Party. So therefore, that being the case, it would be very difficult for Xi Jinping to make concessions externally. Also, Xi Jinping is trying to solidify his base, and he has pursued party-led diplomacy. So the leaders of the foreign diplomacy are beginning to be very accommodative when it comes to the Communist Party. For example, we talked about the press conference by Mr. Wang Yi at the National People's Congress. He used the term leadership of Xi Jinping very frequently. He referred to Xi Jinping's leadership quite frequently. This became very evident, especially in the press conference this time around. And also, furthermore, with regard to the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party, he allowed the national media to ask a question about this, and he provided a long-term explanation. This was geared for the domestic audience. So, the party who is not versed in diplomacy and who is so ideological, if they were to strengthen their intervention in foreign policy, then the sensitivities of foreign policy may decline, and the report from the ground to the central party could be weakened. In other words, difficult home truth may not make their way to Xi Jinping going forward. That could be easily imagined. And also, Xi Jinping has fostered domestic nationalism to gain support from the public. That nationalism is heightened too much, and their hands could be tied when it comes to foreign policy. So in the meeting at Anchorage, Yang Jiechi's comments, very aggressive comments, were welcomed by the national public. The interpretation is that his comments were more for the domestic public and the domestic audience. So domestically, his comments were very well received. On the other hand, as a result, this could actually raise the obstacle and the hurdle, if you will, for China to take more flexible diplomacy toward U.S. and the foreign countries. So that is all for my comment at this juncture. I would like to return my microphone to you. Thank you.
So, I would like to ask Professor Takahara to raise questions and also to give comments to the presentation by Professor Inoue. So let me try to briefly summarize that China is making use of the system of United Nations, not the ideals of the United Nations, but trying to utilize its system to disseminate its own thinking and concept. And in the background of that is the Chinese Communist Party's involvement in the foreign policy making. That could be seen. What is interesting is that the United States, with China, they are trying hard to avoid ideological confrontation. That this is to do with the political regime, that try to make clear the advantage of the democratic system. But as the Professor Inoue has suggested, the way of looking at things in China seems to be unified. So if I could ask Professor Takahara to give his comments inclusive of the points that I have just made. Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. Professor Inoue, thank you very much for very detailed explanation of your study into the statements made by the Chinese foreign policy leaders. What kind of image of China are they trying to project to the world? That has been amply and clearly have been explained. Now, what I would like to speak of is what is the true intent of China, what the Chinese academics are saying amongst each other. So, in a nutshell, this is true also for the foreign policy leaders, but they have both the confidence as well as anxiety. These both thoughts are mixed in the minds of the academics as well as the policy leaders. The so-called the new two-pole world seems to be now increasingly be created. That seems to be the understanding of the many of the academics. As Professor Inoue has suggested, the power of the United States seems to be, relatively speaking, declining. On the other hand, China's power, absolutely and relatively, seems to be becoming greater and stronger. And China no longer is at the receiving end of the international order, but China now has the capability to make a difference in the international order. So there seems to be the new world divided into two poles today, and already that kind of system is already existing. That seems to be the view of many of the Chinese academics. But the way of saying things are different, that they are trying to develop the relationship with the European Union. The Chinese researchers say that. Don't you agree that the world should not be a unipolar world, but it should be a multipolar world? So Europe and China should work closely together to try to create a multipolar world. That is the way of putting things by many of the Chinese leaders and researchers. But on the other hand, they have clearly being recognizing that there seems to be a two-polar world being newly built and emerging. That seems to be the rhetoric domestically. Now, in relation to this, on the part of the United States, it alone cannot counter China, but the United States need to collaborate with the friends and allies and try to create a camp, so to speak, to counter China. And the one interesting way of putting things is the United States is trying to make its China policy to become more Russianized. As U.S. that try to have a categorical confrontation with the USSR. United States is increasingly trying to counter China as it did in the past with the USSR. And China, on the other hand, would like to prevent that to happen. But preventing this may be rather difficult. So, U.S. is trying to create its own camp to counter its own bloc, so to speak, to counter China, be it Southeast Asian countries and other regions. How can China, on the other hand, be able to raise trust and confidence for itself? How should we go about in doing this? That seems to be the way of thinking inside China. So the confrontation competition between China and the United States progresses, and the U.S. will look at its bottom line, the so-called core interest of China. If the U.S. will step over the red line, so to speak, in terms of Chinese core interests, then China would have to deviate and go for creating a new international order. That seems to be the argument and debate going on inside China. But would it be truly beneficial to China or to belong to the U.S. bloc or U.S. camp? Seems to be the leading countries of the world. Now, China, on the other hand, would try to approach the Africa and other regional or the developing countries that are trying to defend its interests. But can Chinese national interest be defended strongly or not? There seems to be still some doubts. So China would like to seek cooperation, the outlets for cooperation with the United States. And as to the political regime, China would not like the United States to interfere. That seems to be the majority of Chinese researchers' expectation and hope. So that is what I would like to say as an introductory remark. Thank you.
Professor Inoue and Professor Takahara, please use the chat function to place your questions. We will continue to take questions throughout the program. Having heard Professor Takahara, even among the Chinese researchers, there's a mixture of confidence and anxiety, and that there's an awareness that the world is becoming a two-polar system. On the other hand, in China, they talk about the small bloc. U.S. is trying to create a small group, and there is beginning to be increasing criticism for the group formation that are being pursued by U.S. But then, if the U.S. is trying to create a small group, is China trying to create a big group in turn? China has advocated the UN system. Maybe the UN system could represent a major system which China aspires to achieve. So the group formation by the U.S. bloc that was pointed out by Professor Takahara, how do they intend to compete? Is China trying to come up with a competing ideology toward that? I would now like to turn to Professor Inoue and also Professor Takahara. I would like to ask a question to both of you. Professor Takahara talked about how U.S. is trying to create a bloc and is trying to compete with China as a result of formation of such a bloc. Now, in turn, China is increasingly critical to such trends. On the other hand, among the U.S. and their allies, there are reports indicating that they perceive a gap between the U.S. and the members of the allies. For example, a report after peace, the G7, and also in the comments made by the Chief Press Secretary of China, such nuances could be read. So, a newspaper that is affiliated with the Chinese Communist Party has actually covered the G7 leaders' communique, and there's an article which talks about the G7 leaders' statement and the communique. The communique was actually created as a concession, although it was led by the United States. And the basis for this is that whether or not to include China in the communique, there seems to be a very heated debate among the leaders as to whether or not to include the reference to China in the G7 leaders communique. That seems to be the basis of the report. And also, the press secretary of China has said that U.S. is sick and they're very seriously ill. That was the comment put forward by the press secretary of China. And also, furthermore, G7 has taken the pulse of, maybe G7 should take the pulse of the United States and should give prescribe prescriptions. So again, he used this term, U.S. to become ill. So their view is that China would not do as U.S. wants. That's to be the nuance of their comments. And in relation to other G7 countries, why not take care of the United States? Why not write prescriptions for the United States? So again, they're not treating the U.S. and their allies on equal footing. So therefore, as was mentioned earlier, on May 31st, Xi Jinping talked about the need to enhance their communication and talked about the creation of a PR mechanism. He provided such instructions on May 31st. Of course, this targets emerging countries, not just to gain support among the emerging countries, but also they're targeting U.S. allies such as Japan and the European countries. They're trying to encourage allies of the United States, such as Japan and Europe, to take greater distance between themselves and the U.S. So in the arguments put forward by China in this context, one should question, why is it that they need to talk about how Marxism is more advantageous, or why the Chinese socialism is so important? Why include reflect sense of values in their comments? Professor Inoue and Professor Takahara, what do you say about the contradiction? Professor Inoue, would you like to take the floor?
Takahara, as well as Mr. Ohara, what Professor Takahara has suggested, the new bipolar world concept. My impression is that the researchers and political scientists in countries other than China, I believe they do not believe that a bipolar world has been created. In East Asia, the bipolar, the regionally bipolar the world may have been created. That seems to an argument that we do hear, not for the whole world, but the regionally, so to speak. U.S. That has its allies and has its influence in the region. On the other hand, China do not have any allies to speak of. So there seems to be a lot of discrepancy between the two countries. And in terms of GDP, China is dramatically growing and coming closer to the United States. And in the latter half of the 21st century, or in a decade or 2 decades, China may take over the United States. The GDP growth rate in the United States, in terms of industrialized countries, it has been receiving the migrants and has had a stable growth of 3%, as different from the other members of the industrialized world. And China, on the other hand, its growth seems to be decelerating. You should not just look at GDP, but also look at the military capability and the soft power as well. So I don't think a bipolar world, as of yet, that has been created. For China, regionally, it may seem as such, but looking at China from outside and from inside, there seems to be a difference in terms of degree of understanding. And as Mr. Ohara has suggested, on the 31st of May, what President Xi Jinping has stated, not only showing confidence, but it should be modest and to be trusted and loved and be respected, to try to project an image of China to the whole world as such. I have also mentioned about the discourse, the so-called Chinese style of discourse. Its storytelling needs to be transmitted to the other countries. The China believes that it has become a great power, so it should also being given respect by the others. That seems to be the argument inside China. But on the other hand, as Mr. Ohara has suggested, the Marxism or socialism, such ideology, of course, the Western countries cannot accept these kind of concepts. But what about the developing countries? To what extent these values and ideas would have some appeal? China, in the past, that had been emphasizing public diplomacy. Public diplomacy is not just the conventional diplomacy, but looking to gain the empathy and sympathy of the other countries, the peoples, and trying to approach in gaining the empathy of the other peoples. And public diplomacy is already a well-established concept. And China, in addition to public diplomacy, China also had to gain the understanding and support of the public opinion inside China. And during the President Hu Jintao's days, they had emphasized the public diplomacy the part. But more recently, they have been emphasizing the Chinese discourse. But what is difficult is public diplomacy primarily should be something to gain empathy and sympathy and understanding of the peoples of the other countries and the international community. That is at the basis, so that the conventional diplomacy will be smoothly managed. Unless you can gain understanding and empathy of the others, even though you may assert and contend on your own ideology, you will not be able to achieve the goal. At the Politburo's, the group study the meeting of the Chinese Communist Party, to be loved and to be respected and trusted. Those are the words that are being used, because the environment surrounding China seems to be getting harsher and more difficult. They do understand that, so they're concerned with that. So I believe what they're trying to do is to respond to those the feelings. But I think that they do not really understand the essence of the public diplomacy, because you need to gain the understanding and empathy of the others, not just strengthening your own communication and transmitting your information. I don't think they have utilized propaganda. They have utilized words and jargons like propaganda, but just by sending your own message would not be sufficient enough.
Advertising or diplomacy, but they talked about communication. But they talked about how media needs to do their job. That was the instruction provided by Xi Jinping. And also, they also made reference to the budget. So it was indicated as a very concrete instruction and guidance. Professor Takahara, your views, please. Thank you. I would like to point out three things, if I may. The first point, the U.S. is trying to enhance their relations with the alliance, and also they are trying to enhance their Quad framework. And also, they're trying to promote D10 and also promotion of coalition with other democracies. And against that backdrop, China is saying that this is very Cold War-centric and that this is simply formation of small groups. So China is living its criticism against such trends by the United States. As was mentioned by Mr. Ohara, this represents a very small group formation. Majority of the countries are actually on the side of the China. That seems to be what China is implying. For example, at the Human Rights Commission in Geneva, or even in UN Human Rights Commission in New York, when they discuss Hong Kong, and also when they talk about Uyghur, Xinjiang issues, the number of countries that support China outnumber the number of countries who criticize China. That is a reality. So one of the reasons why China is prioritizing UN, there are two follows. First is that they're a permanent member of the UN Security Council, and the other reason is that even in the UN General Assembly, in such forums, majority are supporting Chinese position. That situation is there. So these are the two reasons why China is focusing on UN-centric international order. The second point, with regard to the press coverage after G7, It is true that between U.S. and European countries there was a discord. Chinese press seems to be emphasizing the so-called difference between U.S. and the other countries. This goes back to the fact that U.S. and European countries are trying to come together. They're trying to enhance their ties. And together they're trying to confront China. And China wants to stop such a situation. I think it's a reflection of such intention on the part of the Chinese. And the third point, as was mentioned by Mr. Ohara, the advantages of Marxism being emphasized. Indeed, this is in relation to the domestic situation. They're very mindful about the domestic prevailing situation. As far as Xi Jinping is concerned, he wants to safeguard the legitimacy of a party-centric system in China. So the legitimacy of his rule. He understands that this is vulnerable. So that is why Xi Jinping wants to make sure that he pursues education and advertising. And he wants to make sure that people's support can be contained, people's support can be gained for the current system. Indeed, they're about to celebrate 100th anniversary since the establishment of the Communist Party. And he wants to promote, he's carrying out a campaign to learn about the history of the Communist Party. And the reason is that he wants to pursue the continued support, continued rule by the Communist Party. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Once again, raise question to both the professors, going through that cycle once again, and then open the floor for questions from the audience. So, we have just heard that China is trying to counter the United States and trying to establish its own worldview. And for the domestic audience, there seems to be some rhetoric going on, and that seems to be quite influential. And that is often seen in the study of China. On the other hand, Professor Takahara has suggested that amongst the Chinese researchers, that there seems to be a new bipolar world that seems to be created. But on the other hand, that President Xi Jinping has clearly stated that China is against the new Cold War. The Cold War philosophy or the Cold War structure, those terminology being used by China seems to be quite mindful and conscious of what is going on. And China is trying to strengthen its own communication capability. So for the bipolar the system, is China trying to accept that, or as President Xi Jinping has publicly been speaking, trying to avoid or avert that to happen? I would like to ask both Professor Inoue and Professor Takahara to briefly respond, please. Professor Inoue, could you start? Thank you. As Professor Takahara has suggested, China would like to avoid any confrontation on a frontal side. But this is not something that China can have control over. On the other hand, what is becoming clearer is that not only United States, but many of the Western countries seems to be becoming increasingly harsher in its view vis-a-vis China. On the other hand, the United States is not trying to drive a wedge between Europe and other countries and China, but from China's point of view, it still seems as if United States is trying to form a group and trying to counter China. Now, what about the ROK? And what about the Southeast Asian countries for China? So they're trying to bring them over. But as a trend, vis-a-vis China, it seems that the ambience seems to be becoming increasingly difficult for China. I would like to watch closely what would be the response from China. Thank you.
Indeed, China was the major country among the developing countries, but now they're beginning to gain influence on a global scale. And that has helped to tickle a sense of pride among the Chinese public. So against such a backdrop, in one sense, China is very pleased. I would imagine. But on the other hand, that may have caused a very difficult confrontation between China and the United States. About that possibility, China is also very wary. They want to avoid such a confrontation. They want to seek cooperation to the extent possible with the United States. And China wants to stabilize its ties with the United States. I would imagine that that is the real intention of the Chinese. I see. Thank you very much. We have received many questions from the audience. I would like to, we have received questions individually for each of the professors. So let's start with the question for Professor Inoue. China is trying to gain the support of the developing economies, but at the same time, through exchange student program, they are trying to make sure that they keep the ideology based so that they don't question about their own system. That's some of the questions for Professor Inoue. Question to Professor Takahara. The U.S., in order to solidify the alliance among the Western countries, are they trying to emphasize the risk and threat posed by China as they used to do with USSR? Professor Inoue, would you like to start?
Good question. So the Ideological Foundation, is China trying to present such a foundation? Looking at the overall trend, for example, there are many Chinese students being received by many countries. Up until a few years ago, there were many Chinese students in the United States, even though the United States is getting tougher on the China. And those the students are becoming increasingly patriotic. Those the previous generation who have studied abroad and gone back to the China, and they have a more international perspective. So more recent group of the Chinese students are becoming increasingly ideological and patriotic. But my feeling is that they are not that seems to be the mindful.
Regardless of what the U.S. may say, as far as China is concerned, they may go on to the other end of the earth, where they are actually going to Mars. The Chinese are already going to all these different places. On the other hand, when it comes to human rights, suppressing human rights in Hong Kong, in various other aspects, China has taken a very unique position and has taken various unique measures. And for many countries, such measures taken by China simply are not acceptable. So that's how the Chinese act. So in that regard, are they trying to portray China like the former Soviet USSR? The Chinese, by the way, the Chinese researchers use the term Russia, not USSR. But so regardless of what USSR does, I believe many people in the world are mindful about China in this regard, I believe. Thank you.
Received as well. So this is a question to both of you. On China's very tough policy, the so-called wolf warrior type of diplomacy. This hardline diplomacy, where is the rationale for China? On the 31st of May, President Xi Jinping has instructed that from the other countries and foreign countries and peoples, China needs to be understood by them. But on the other hand, there seems to be very hardlining policy, such as being termed wolf warrior type of policy. So not only external factors, but what that has been said by China is mostly for the domestic audience. But with domestic audience type of rhetoric, would that be the only reasoning? Now also there are other English questions. The so-called wolf warrior type of hardline stance by China. what can we do to try to persuade, to try to mitigate or ameliorate such tough stance? If I could ask Professor Inoue to start in your response, I don't think I will be able to give a good answer to both questions. Whether it is reasonable or not, looked from Japanese sense of values, it is not reasonable at all. The so-called wolf warrior type of policy. With the wolf warrior diplomacy, China seems to be losing its friends as compared to the past. On the other hand, on the part of China, there seems to be some self-reflection going on. So more recently, they are not stating too much of the so-called wolf warrior type of policy. But a person like the Deputy Press Secretary of the Foreign Ministry is intentionally making some stronger statements. But more recently, China seems to be mitigating so much. But so strategically, the so-called hardline policy, even before it was termed as a hardline policy, it has not changed too much because President Xi Jinping's way of thinking on foreign policy and diplomacy seems to be based on such tough line to start with.
Depends on the definition of the so-called wolf warrior diplomacy. For example, the diplomats, they put on a very stern face and they carry on very stern discourse. There has been a discussion internally in China about the validity of such diplomacy. Is it rational or not? Is there rationale? Indeed, I think there is an aspect that this has been done for the benefit of the domestic audience. But on the other hand, if within the scope of the wolf warrior diplomacy, this includes economic sanctions, for example, take the example of the neighbor, South Korea, when they tried to introduce THAAD from the United States. China carried out very severe economic sanctions against South Korea, and they're placed under very difficult circumstances. So that approach seemed to be very effective. And so as a result, South Korea, with regard to Hong Kong and with regard to Uyghur Xinjiang issue, South Korea has refrained from criticizing China. So therefore, using economic power in a geoeconomic and the geoeconomics method, leveraging economic power, that is what China is trying to resort to right now. And that seems to be gaining expected results on the part of China in certain cases. And I believe China is aware of that situation.
China is approaching the foreign countries, so they have the mixed traditional approach of the hard line and the softer the line, the so-called the coercive and the more cooperative the line. The deputy, the press secretary's statement was mentioned earlier, and Katsuhiko Hokusai's farcical, the ukiyo-e block the print, the picture has been used. That Japan has decided to release the treated the water from the Fukushima Daiichi the nuclear power plant. So he is deliberately doing this in making those statements. And as for military pressure applied to Taiwan, in terms of press report, it is subsiding, but the actual pressure has not been reduced at all. So taking all sorts of different means, trying to indicate both coercive as well as cooperative the ways of dealing with the other country. So depending on which country would be the subject, the way of applying those pressures would be different. There is another question, the effectiveness of the Marxist ideas. Is China believing that the Marxist ideas are effective. People have been saying that more recently China has becoming more realistic. So even though she is still asserting the socialism as well as Marxism, but they are behaving more realistically. That seems to have been the accepted assessment. But more recently, China is increasingly becoming ideological. So if that is the case, to what extent China itself is believing the Marxist ideas? Now, the United States, there is a discourse not to bring in any ideology for or the foreign policy or diplomacy. But what about China? Is there any opposition against such stance, Professor Inoue?
As the advantage of the Marxism is concerned, well, around the world, the number of socialist countries are becoming to be quite limited in number, almost non-existence. So that being the case, this is indeed an inward discussion, domestic-oriented discussion. So this is the logic for the domestic audience that is seen in the context of the Chinese diplomacy, and that has just spilled out outside China. And this it's not subject to a lot of checking. Diplomatic professionals would ordinarily check such discourse ordinarily. And because of the researchers, since there are a lot of Chinese experts who are cognizant, who are well versed in things outside China, and they would actually help to shift the course, but that is not the case. Why? And this is something you really can't sense unless you're inside China. But this part represents the atmosphere in China. Up until now, with regard to Chinese policy, various views would have been reflected. And part of the researchers would have voiced their views about the policies. But since a few years ago, when I talked to my acquaintances, it's very difficult for them to talk publicly about their views when it comes to major policies, such as Chinese policy toward the U.S. So they're beginning to be very silent. Many people are remaining silent on these matters, I believe. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Takahara. Whether China is convinced of Marxist ideas, the Chinese leaders would go into hiding in the mountain and try to make a revolution once again. I don't think that is the case at all. So it is just the way of exigency or convenience. Now, it was 4 years ago at the party, the National Convention of the Communist Party, the President Xi Jinping that has been emphasizing the Chinese Communist Party's leadership to be strengthened. Now, nobody believes that the serious issues and problems confronting China could be solved by the leadership of the Communist Party. And that seems to be the biggest dilemma, the so-called socialist market economy. There is a lot of contradiction and problems to do with it. And I don't think a majority of the Chinese people believes that this can continue indefinitely.
And approach China. With regard to Indo-Pacific region, well, free and open Indo-Pacific region, that concept might be effective when dealing with China. We have received many questions to that end. Now, this year, Xi Jinping and the Chinese leaders, if they are to come to visit Japan for the Olympic Games or to commemorate the 50th anniversaries of diplomacy between Japan and China next year, how should Japan approach this matter? Professor Inoue and Professor Takahara, one word each, please.
Japan does have very difficult issue with China, especially the territorial issue. So in a nutshell, we need a strong deterrence, and deterrence as well as a diplomatic approach needs to be combined. Because we do have a strong deterrence, we could also send over to China a diplomatic message.
Because of COVID-19, dialogue between Japan and China is totally insufficient. That is my view. Between Japan and China, for many, many years, we've had competition as well as collaboration. We've had both aspects of collaboration and cooperation and competition, especially since the incident involving the crash of the fishing vessel in 2010. This type of relationship has to be continued for the time being. But it seems that recently, the aspect of competition seems to be emphasized. I suppose that is inevitable. But cooperation and dialogue, we should not negate that either. We need to, in a more tangible fashion, appeal the need for dialogue and collaboration. It's not all about competition. We need to portray such an attitude in a very tangible manner. So free and open Indo-Pacific. As far as this contest is concerned, it might be in competition with the Belt and Road Initiative, but also in collaboration with this Belt and Road Initiative. We should not forget that. Thank you.
Had a presentation by Professor Inoue of Kwansei Gakuin University entitled Worldview of China in Competition with the New U.S. Administration, and we have had good discussion. There seems to be competition, seems to be the mainstay when it comes to relationship between United States and China. But still, for mutual understanding to be deepened, we need to continue to make efforts in this regard. I would like to thank both Professors Inoue and Takahara. I would like now to close this public forum. Thank you.
Entitled SPF China Observer. Thank you very much. This will conclude the session. We appreciate your attendance. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. That is the end of this forum.